Welcome to the Jewish Museum in Hohenems, and we are proud to have two wonderful guests tonight. Bashir Bashir from Jerusalem, who will present us his ideas and will discuss these with us, and Gertrud Auer from the Kreisky Forum in Vienna, who organized this event together with us. Welcome everybody here in Hohenems, but also welcome everybody who is listening to this lecture and discussion on Zoom and on YouTube, wherever you are. Let's welcome together Bashir Bashir, who is our guest tonight. And let me just introduce you with a few words. Bashir Bashir is associate professor at the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Communication at the Open University of Israel, and is also senior research fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. And his primary research interests are nationalism and citizenship studies, multiculturalism, democratic theory, memory, and the politics of reconciliation. And all these subjects, as one could easily imagine, are heavily connected with each other in the subject that we are going to discuss tonight, the attempt to discuss the Arab and Jewish questions with relation to the entangled, intertwined conflicts around Israel and Palestine. Bashir Bashir has published in a lot of leading journals on all these subjects. He is the co-editor of The Politics of Reconciliation in Multicultural Societies, a book he published together with Will Kiblitzka in 2008. He published together with Azar Dakwar the book Rethinking the Politics of Israel, Palestine, Partition and Its Alternatives in 2014, and most recently, The Arab and Jewish Questions with Laila Farsakh. And we, in a way, take this book as a starting point for tonight's presentation, but also the trajectory between these books that also include the Holocaust and the Nakba, with Amos Goldberg in 2018, and how these different books relate to each other and all relate to the question around Israel-Palestine. You will try to make us understand a little this night, and we'll get into a discussion about it. And I also want to introduce Gertrud Auer to you, who's heading, she's a director of the Kreisky Forum for International Relations in Vienna, and her activities, and I understood tonight, go back to the 1990s already with Bashir Bashir, and you please tell us a little about the context, how all these books relate to Vienna.
Well, it started, good evening, as Hanno said, I'm the Secretary General of the Bruno Kreisky Forum in Vienna, and in this capacity, the co-organizer of tonight's discussion. Actually, the friendship and the working relationship with Professor Bashir goes back into the 90s, when I was in charge of organizing together with the Kreisky Forum the Middle East Youth Peace Forum, which was a gathering of young people. I think all over were about 150 young people all over the years who worked together from 1994 to 1999, and Bashir was one of the youngest participants at that time. Luckily, we never lost each other, and we started working together when he was in his academic career. So Professor Bashir is a senior fellow at the Bruno Kreisky Forum since the last 10 years, when we started working on rethinking the politics of Israel-Palestine, which was then published by Bashir and Azar Dakwar, as a result of a discussion that we had with a group of Israelis and Palestinians, but essentially as a discussion that we had in the European Parliament. At that time, the European Parliament was gracious to host us various times and to debate Israel-Palestine on a very high-level discussion. From this point on, we engaged in the so-called Arab and Jewish question, which included over the years, and I have to say it's almost 10 years that we are having the group working together, over 150 intellectuals from all over the globe, Jews and Arabs, not necessarily focused only on Israel-Palestine, but on a broader level. And the book that Bashir and Leila published last November at Columbia University Press is a kind of not a summary, but a presentation of main ideas which were in the heart of the discussion. I just wanted to add that we are here in Hohenems. I'm very grateful that I'm here tonight. We are going back to Vienna tomorrow because a group of 20 Jews and Arabs are coming on Thursday to sit together again and work together for the next days in Vienna on a new round of the Jewish-Arab engagement, this time on resilience and resistance in Palestinian literature that we are very, very much looking forward to host. Thank you very much and good evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Now the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much, Hanu. Thanks very much, Gertrude. It's a great honor to be here. Thanks to the museum as well as to the Kreisky Forum for hosting me, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. So let me upfront tell you what is my argument so we don't get lost from the very beginning, to make it very simple. And the very simple story is that we had 3 projects. One project is called Alternatives to Partition, the second project called the Holocaust and the Nakba, and the third project is called the Arab and the Jewish Questions. These 3 questions, or these 3 projects, I claim, put together, they are part and parcel of what is emerging as the new moral and political grammar for Israel-Palestine. Now, this new moral and political grammar for Israel-Palestine has different dimensions, but these 3 books are tackling some of these dimensions, not all of them. The most important claim is that these 3 elements put together create, generate, or give rise to what we call the new moral and political grammar for Israel-Palestine. One of the most important things in this project is not to remain at the level of diagnosis, but also to go and prognose. That is to say, it's not enough to say that these 3 projects together generate a new moral political grammar. Then the question becomes also, what is this new moral and political grammar, and how productive and instructive it is? And the argument that I am pushing also tonight is to suggest that egalitarian binationalism, which I will unpack and define shortly, is the answer, or is the way forward to engage with the question of Israel-Palestine. So this is basically, if you wish, the story in 2 minutes. But let me unpack this story in about 15 to 20 minutes, so we give it more substance, if you wish. And the substance is that we need to understand, first of all, why this intervention is of a value. And the intervention, meaning these 3 projects put together, is of a value for a very simple observation that at least motivates me. And that is that for the past 20 years, there has been this feeling, which is very true feeling, but also represents itself in different magnitudes and different manifestation, is that the question of Israel-Palestine is in a deadlock. And there is something that is disorienting in relation to that. And why is that? Because the terminologies, concepts, terms let us call it the paradigm that existed for many decades, has been losing some of its explanatory power. That is to suggest that some of the terms, some of the concepts, some of the vocabularies that helped us navigate our way through understanding the question of Israel-Palestine lost some of the great deal of credibility in understanding and capturing the realities that are evolving in Israel-Palestine. Therefore, there has been this feeling of frustration or deadlock or invitation for innovation and invitation for trying to understand things differently. And the project at the Kreisky Forum and many other arms of it has been trying to engage with these types of deadlock in order to say that we can actually create and craft a new way of looking at this question. And the way of looking at the question of Israel-Palestine differently hasn't been the preoccupation of only myself. It has been preoccupying dozens, if not a lot of, many scholars and many activists and many politicians and diplomats, because also diplomats at least and politicians in the past 10 years have come to the realization that they are in a deadlock and they are in trap. So the main motivation that motivated me to embark on this project was that there is this need for this new perspective, for a new language, for new terms that will enable us to make better sense of the realities that we are witnessing, which the most important features of these realities is that Israel's colonial expansion has been undergoing under the pretext of a peace process. So while Israel was speaking peace, it was doing all it can do actually to kill that peace through the occupation and through the expansion of its colonial settlements. But that's not only an observation that remains at the level of describing. That is also something that led to the fact that many of what we have used in order to understand Israel-Palestine actually is starting to lose its relevance or to lose its capacity of understanding and interpreting the reality and making sense of it. And there are those who have shared this observation by saying that we are in a deadlock. We need new terms. We need a new imagination. We need a new language, new paradigm, different terminologies than different descriptions that were, entertained in the markets of idea and in the world of politics. Some came to rethink Israel-Palestine and the question of Palestine through, for instance, micro history, focusing in micro cases. Like the other day, yesterday, Hano and I were talking about Haifa, and we were speaking about these new historians or some Palestinian historians, but also non-Palestinian historians trying to look at Haifa as through a different lens through which they can also seek to rethink Israel-Palestine through this micro history and through alternative forms of engaging with the history of Palestine. Others resorted to political economy. Others have done actually anthropology, and some have mixed these things. And many of these attempts were zooming in order to differently understand Israel-Palestine and the new dynamic that the Israeli central colonial realities have created. In my case, I actually rather zoomed out. And this is where we start to begin to understand the project, why we are talking about Europe. Because the Jewish question is a European question and is a European phenomenon. So one might ask, so what Europe has to do? This is exactly and precisely why in my project, I try to zoom out. And try to zoom out, meaning that I try to also add to these different micro and local perspectives, a larger perspective through which you try to understand the question of Israel-Palestine. And there is no way for you to understand the question of Israel-Palestine without understanding that larger context, which involve empires, where partition comes in as an imperial tool that was introduced by the British Empire that controlled Palestine through the Balfour Declaration and different kind of subsequent kind of committees and the Peel Commissions and many other things that relate to that. So empires are extremely important, and empires are related to European history and manifestation. The second thing is that actually Zionism has been a European movement coming to answer a European question and address a European problem. And in that sense, actually, this is why we are coming back to Europe, okay? This is why Europe is a starting point of analysis for the question of Palestine and many other things. This is not the end point. And I shortly also will connect Europe also as naturally, we are in a very interesting cultural space that it's called the Jewish Museum, that intimately linked to the history, the modern history of European Jewry, which is intimately linked to persecution, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. And this brings us to the second component. And the last component that I wish also to do is also that we cannot today speak about European racism in contemporary time, and definitely anti-Semitism in isolation from Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is a very worrying also form of phenomena in this. So all of this put together, if you wish, are very much at the center of my talk. But since I am zooming out, I want to tell you by zooming out that this project of speaking about Israel-Palestine in this meta zooming out perspective cannot be understood without actually going back to European political modernity, or to political modernity. And, you know, and I don't want really to overwhelm you with many things, but political modernity has an extremely important context to understand Israel-Palestine for the following two reasons, at least. I'm not being, you know, exhaustive now. I am being reductionist and selective. Two main features of political modernity have been so critical for understanding and setting the context. The first element in these, you know, there are two elements that are co-founding, constitutive of political modernity, okay? The first one is basically the drive of the nation state for homogeneity and purity. I will shortly explain that. And the second context and the second element is the drive for basically settler colonialism, also as part and a constitutive feature of, you know, political modernity. And that is basically the drive for elimination, of, you know, that is very central at the very definition, at the very core of defining, you know, settler colonialism as a constitutive feature of modernity. Now, how are these related to Israel-Palestine? One might come, because as these are features of modernities, and as features of political modernities, they entail and they have core concepts through which let us call them fixes of modernity. And these fixes of modernities are nation states, settler colonialism, citizenship, boundaries, sovereignty, you know, different terms and coordinates of modernity. Now, how, you know, problematizing these kind of fixes, you know, and features of modernities through problematizing these kind of national concepts are very much related to understanding basically Zionism as you know, as a form of settler colonial movement in the Middle East rather than in Europe, because that's the interesting story. And actually Zionism was trying to offer an answer to the Jewish question, okay, which is a European question. More than anything, it's an Austrian, German, Hungarian, Slovakian question, and many other European contexts than it is a Palestinian or a Iraqi, or for that sake, a Syrian or a Lebanese or an Egyptian question. So my point about this is actually that if we are seriously taking this on board, we will understand that actually this kind of settler colonialism and drive of modernity is very intimately linked to, if you wish, Eurocentric Western notion of modernity, that very much at the core of it is also, there is this element of Western anti-Semitism, Western anti-Semitism that actually needs to be unpacked and understood in relation also to colonialism and Orientalism, okay? So this is basically, if you wish, the larger context within which you need to understand, or we need to understand this. And before I go to elaborate on each one of these three dimensions that I mentioned, alternatives to partition, the Arab and the Jewish question, and the Holocaust and Nakba, let me just demonstrate the proof, at least to you, in order to show you why these things that I am referring to as constitutive dimensions of modernity are related to understanding of what is happening today in Europe and by extension in Israel-Palestine. Let us take, for instance, one of the most interesting things in the past 2 decades is the discourse of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is indispensable, basically indispensable element from the, you know, the indispensable elements of the articulation and the reproduction of modernity political fixes, the way I am speaking about it. And in that sense, actually, one of the most interesting things that this is intimately linked to the ways. In that sense, the ways this kind of Islamophobia is bound to Western anti-Semitism and Orientalism. How does that demonstrate itself? Demonstrate itself that actually in the resurgence of the discourse of anti-Semitism today in Europe, today as we speak, okay? It's interesting that actually the discourse that we speak about anti-Semitism exactly testifies to this logic where I speak about this connection between anti-Semitism, Orientalism, and Islamophobia. And how does that represent itself? It represents itself that when we speak about anti-Semitism, instead of being reminded about the troubles that underlying European Western modernity, and that is its failure to give an answer to the Jewish question and to the Jewish existence through the failure of Christian European nationalism to accommodate the Jews, we are shouldering the blame on what? On the Muslim as a racialized other, through which we are directing the energy to the Muslims through whitewashing the Europeans through their philo-Semitism of the fascination with, the state of Israel, and actually the support of Austria and its regime through the blind courts policies, which is disgraceful in the case of Israel, is actually a testimony to the way actually these types of the use and the abuse and the interlink between actually anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and surely in Europe today, how anti-Semitism is already charged to display and weaponize against Palestinian advocacy for rights. What does that come to be together all? When Palestinians are Muslims and Christian Arabs are being named as the ones that carry these kind of accusations when they demand their just causes for equality and justice, this is wrapped in the language of what? Of anti-Semitism. This brings us again to the fact that actually the Jewish question and the Muslim question and the Palestinian questions are inseparable, okay? So that's kind of the meta perspective. So let me move from the meta perspective to explain each one of these three dimensions of the project. And to remind you, I was starting to say that there are three components: alternatives to partition, the Holocaust and the Nakba, and the Arab and the Jewish questions as three intersecting themes, components that together generate a better context for understanding Israel, Palestine, and by extension, understanding Europe as well. Okay, so what is partition in that sense? Let me unpack each one of these three elements and then conclude with the egalitarian binationalism. Partition is a colonial tool through an imperial imagination introduced mostly by the British Empire, through which partition was designed and looked at as a tool and a vehicle through which you settle the conflict between the Palestinian native population of Palestine and the Zionist settler colonial movement that came from Europe to settle in Palestine. And through that partition, the question was that partitioning territorially the land between the Arabs and the Israeli Jews or the colonialist Jews that came from Europe would be the way forward. Now, what we are witnessing in the past 2 decades, that this paradigm of having to go through the language of, homogeneity of having a Jewish state. What is a Jewish state? Jewish state is a very vulgar interpretation of ethnic nationalism of Europe applied into the Middle East, where basically it's coming as an intervention in the flesh of the Palestinian context. And therefore, this seeking of homogeneity, which by definition will define the Palestinian as an other that needs to be controlled, ruled, or eliminated, is very troubling. And in the context of where Israel actually policies have been consistently pushed in a way where through they try to basically destroy the possibility of territorial partition. Because if Israel was really indeed interested in partition, why Israel is building actually in Nablus and next to Nablus, which is at the very heart of the West Bank? If you are interested in peace, actually you would rather, not build in the heart of the West Bank. And not making, since we are close to Switzerland, there is often analogy that is being used by many scholars, why are you creating, a Swiss-style cheese of reality in the West Bank through where the different spots of the Arabs are being, connected through channels and through types of bypass roads, through creating these, Israeli Jewish colonialist settler colonialist bodies that are called the settlements through the at the middle of the Palestinian body, which basically means fragmenting the Palestinian territorial continuity. To a cut long story short, because this is not the only dimension of why partition as a paradigm is starting heavily to lose some very significant powers. There are many other dimensions. The most important conclusion in this respect, that partition is losing great deal of relevance due to many considerations, most importantly, the Israeli colonial facts on the grounds that are continuing to transform and shape the context of the West Bank as we speak, through which it creates more intertwined realities, rather than actually the way Israel maintains these intertwined realities is actually through racial segregation, domination, control, through bypass roads, checkpoints, and fences and walls, and many other techniques of surveillance and control. And anyone that would visit the West Bank will immediately realize that. And actually, that's the proof where they try to segregate, but actually in reality of intertwinement. So this is the first observation. And therefore, there was a need to really revisit partition, cast serious doubts, and try to, if you wish, imagine and craft a way forward how you can transcend partition. And this is the context within which we are talking about the need to create this new paradigm. The second dimension is actually the Holocaust and the Nakba. In my joint enterprise with my colleague and a friend, Amos Goldberg, who is a Holocaust scholar from the Hebrew University, also we try to understand that in a way of better understanding the question of Israel-Palestine, we actually need to go and address the most troubling traumas of both people in a different ways, you know, despite the fact that these are asymmetrical and very different. The Holocaust is very different from the Nakba, but nevertheless, they are constitutive foundational past and memories that continue to shape the imagination and the consciousness of these two groups. And therefore, when these two things are usually, I mean, the Holocaust and the Nakba usually are presented as separate, actually they are intimately intersecting historically, politically, and culturally. And we show in our joint work, Amos Goldberg and I, how the Holocaust and the Nakba are intertwined, although there are grave differences and asymmetries between them, how they are intersecting culturally, politically, and ethically. And the interesting dimensions that we say that it's often that these are two events that are, you know, depicted and referred to as totally separate when they are actually interlinked. Because actually one of the most almost, you know, one of the very trivial historical reference is actually that the Nakba happened in 1948 and the Holocaust was happening around, you know, 44, 43, 45. And then, you know, these types of dimensions, I mean, and then the creation of the state of Israel, you know. So actually the Palestinian Nakba would have been impossible without some European dynamics and, you know, the disgusting murderous industry of Nazi death that has been done against European Jewry and many other groups, but mostly in relation of our context to European Jewry. So these are very important elements through which actually any way to rethink Israel-Palestine and to create this new perspective to Israel-Palestine, one of the entries is not only rethinking partition, but also rethinking the relationship between the Holocaust and the Nakba. And therefore, the Holocaust and the Nakba need and ought to be put together in conversation for a constructive form of, you know, kind of relation in order to see how we can have a joint venture of living together and dwelling between the Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. And through that, actually, Amos and I indicate that there is an instructive way and productive way of engaging with these types of memories through which we can penetrate a better kind of imagination. And we deduct that basically binationalism to be the platform forward. The third one then, where, you know, the Kreisky Forum has been extremely instrumental in all of these discussions. But the Kreisky Forum became extremely prominent in the partition, but also extremely prominent in the third component, and that is the Arab and the Jewish question. And that is actually the realization that you cannot understand Palestine today without interrogating Europe. That is basically without going back to understand where the origins of the Jewish questions are. And in that sense, actually, the origins of the Jewish questions are in understanding this larger perspective of political modernity, where nationalism was introduced after the imperial order. The national order was introduced, through which actually you see there is this drive for homogeneity and purity that led to genocide, ethnic cleansing, redrawing of boundaries in many parts of Europe, okay? In Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in Germany, and in many other places. And it is this context within which we need to understand, this is the context within which we need to understand how the question of Palestine was created in the first place. Because the question of Palestine, the way we came to realize it and to experience it, definitely since the first settlers, Zionist settlers made their way back to Palestine, this needs to be understood in relation to interrogating European nationalism. Through that, European nationalism is not only a past story, because there is a mistake that understand that as a past story is very troubling, because that is also related to the way European and Western civilization is dealing with Israel, with Zionism, supporting the Jewish existence in Palestine, as well as in relation to also how anti-Semitism is coming into the equation through its different dimensions, through philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and through which actually all of that is being labeled through the focus on Islamophobia as to be the one and the excuse through actually escaping to understand the underlying currents and the underlying structural issues that are at the very core of the defining of what Europe is, and that is the failure of basically Christian European nationalism to come to terms with the other, and that is the ultimate other in relation to Europe was obviously the Jews, and the failure of basically Europe to come to that. And therefore, this kind of national order and nationalism as the grammar that defines our understanding of politics in modern time through the Middle East also has another leg which has to do very importantly here, which is basically also Arab nationalism. And that way, actually, our work through this book that we published, I would say it is, this European, the Arab and the Jewish questions are an invitation to interrogate Europe, to interrogate Zionism, and to interrogate also Arab nationalism. Now, in the last 5 minutes that I have, I want to say, do I have 5 minutes, Hanu? Okay, very good. What do we make out of these three intersecting questions? And we, up to this point, were describing, diagnosing. And one of the things that have been motivating me, with the help of many other colleagues that were mentioned here, with Amos, Azar, and many other, and Layla, and many other friends that I have been working with, or individually in my research work, that it's not enough to leave the question at the level of diagnosis. And it's not enough to describe, because that is one very important step, because the terminologies, the vocabularies, the terms you use to understand reality are extremely important as a starting point of analysis, but they are not sufficient. You need to move one step forward, and that also, in order to criticize the reality that you are experiencing, you need to have judgment on this reality through envisioning a different moral standards through which you can criticize this reality. And one of the things that we identify, again, in my joint work with others, but also in my individual work, we identify egalitarian binationalism as the ethical principle that guides us that cuts against the grains of political modernity, the way it manifests itself in Israel-Palestine. Okay? And what is that egalitarian binationalism? Egalitarian binationalism, the way I subscribe to it and develop it, which I will shortly describe it, not only goes cuts against the grains of, against the grains of political modernity, the way I spoke about it, but it also invites and gives us tools through which we can unsettle the fixes of this political modernity in Israel-Palestine through its actually questioning vulgar nationalism, the way Zionism manifested itself in the mainstream, settler colonialism as an eliminatory work, and partition and segregation and racial hierarchy as the thing that we need to contest. And therefore, egalitarian binationalism comes as an alternative to all of this, okay? Now, what is egalitarian binationalism? Egalitarian binationalism, the way I understand it, is the language through which we recognize the existence of two national groups, where these two national groups are entitled to sets of political rights. Most chiefly among these rights are the right to national self-determination, through which you envision a form of a relationship and joint dwelling that is premised on parity recognition and mutual legitimacy. None of that might happen without coming to terms with what? The ongoing consequences of the Palestinian Nakba. Nothing would come to that without coming to terms with the ongoing consequences of the Palestinian Nakba. And therefore, egalitarian binationalism, the way we design it or the way we envision it as an ethical principle, as a conceptual frame, is an extremely important one to understand a process of decolonization, where at the core of this process of decolonization is the dismantling of any form of Jewish supremacy, any form of Jewish exclusivity, or any form of privilege. In favor of what? In favor of egalitarian binationalism, meaning in favor of joint dwelling, shared kind of arrangement, and through basically equality. Now, the most troubling element, and by this I finish, it is often depicted recently that actually equality, when you insist as a Palestinian or as a Jew who is concerned, or an Israeli Jew or a Jew in general, or even many others, non-Jews or non-Arabs, who are insisting on equality and justice and freedom as principles that need to guide us in order to dismantle this racial Jewish supremacy of domination in Palestine, you are immediately accused of being anti-Semite or a very problematic kind of designation, which is very troubling. And by that, I think it's about time that it is alarming to us that we need to insist that equality and supporting and endorsing and cherishing equality is not an evil to fight, but it's a value to support, endorse, and actually cherish rather than something to fight. And this is why I think in the context of Austria and in the context of the Jewish Museum where we are, it is extremely critical to understand that we ought to make sure that we don't conflate the criticism, the valid, legitimate, rightly so, criticism of the state of Israel and its disgusting policies of racial segregation and domination with anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism is real, is problematic, needs to be fought, and need to be deconstructed and dig deep into the tradition of Europe to understand its roots, and the failure and the extension of that by the failure of Europe today to deal with its Muslim others through its logic of racialization and through making these racial hierarchies. To cut and close up, egalitarian binationalism is not only helpful in order to rid Israel-Palestine, but it's a very effective way also of projecting what is problematic in Europe and in European modernity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I have to say that this book is breathtaking reading that really leads into open space of thinking about the conflict. And it poses all kinds of questions. And it also poses a number of questions it doesn't answer. It would be too simple to expect that from the book and the essays collected in it. But I just want to present a bit of my reading of the book and the questions that came to my mind reading it. And one of the questions is centered on something that is also something to realize reading it, and that is a basic problem of our vision of modern liberalism or liberal modernity. And that is a question that puzzles me, not that much because of Israel and Palestine, but even much more because it's a question for Europe. And it's a question for Austria and the European Union and wherever. This is one subject I would like to address a little. The other question is a question about the concept of binationalism and the question, who are the nations that could be organized in a kind of binational egalitarian agreement or balance or whatever. The third question is about sovereignty and what constitutes sovereignty, which is connected to the concept of self-determination that I also would love to question in a way. And the last question I have is about the concept of what is a native and what is a settler. And to start the question about liberalism, what I find striking is that if you look into the history of political Zionist thinking about Israel and Palestine, and let's just start with the Balfour Declaration, you have an image that is addressing the question as there is a people that has a national right of self-determination there that deserves a national home. It's not called a state in the Balfour Declaration, but it's called somehow slipping around that word, a national home. And then the Balfour Declaration mentions another population, the natives that, or the people living there, the population that is already there, that should not be harmed in their rights. But it's very much explicit that these people don't have a national right to be there. So they are not allowed to call that a territory a national home there. So the liberal concept of the Balfour Declaration is, and that is very much true for many liberal perceptions of nations and citizenship and the relationship between national and civil rights, even the most modern liberal concept of a state somehow implicitly thinks this entity as somehow homogeneous. And it has no answer to the question how to relate to collective entities inside of it and how to grant collective rights to them. And it very much implicitly refers to a homogenic or a dominance of a cultural and religious concept in which then liberalism grants individual rights to everybody on an equal base, but always with this implicit idea of a very homogeneous body of people. The interesting thing is that, and that means that in one way or the other, with the Balfour Declaration, there was always implied a kind of one-state solution, which means there's one state that has a national sovereignty and it has minorities that it either tolerates, grants civil rights, or maybe expulses, send them out violently or by other measures. But there was always the idea of one national state there, a one-state solution in one way or the other. It had no idea of how this one state could relate to its whatever minorities. But on the other hand, if you look into the history of the Palestinian development to become a kind of a nation, a people that somehow defines itself as a body different from other Arab nations, there was also always a kind, in my perception at least, a kind of one-state solution that was, there's Palestine. And we maybe grant the native Jews who lived there before, whatever, 1748, whatever, we grant them individual rights, but no collective rights, at least no national rights. And very slowly, from both sides of this spectrum, inside of the Jewish discussion about the future of this place on earth, and in the Palestinian discussion about it, slowly, there was a realization that there are others who have a right to live there. And the partition was always a fantasy, how to solve the problem in one way or the other, that was based on one-state solutions, maybe two one-state solutions, but one-state solutions. But they were always following this idea in the end of a concept of a homogeneous nation in which maybe minorities are tolerated, but the decision who is tolerated and not would be with the majority. And talking about egalitarian binationalism is the only door to open an open space to redefine that. But it's still a question, and it's a question because who are the nations who form this binationalism? Because, and that is my second question, the Arab and Jewish questions. But it's not the Arab nation and it's not the Jewish nation. It's the Israeli Jewish nation and the Palestinian Arab nation. And the question is, at which point these two bodies could start to act with a certain kind of independence from the big Arab world that instrumentalizes the Palestinians and uses the Palestinians for whatever purpose, and the Jewish world that is also projecting interests into Israel and projecting things into that without actually being part of it, living here, living in America, living whatever, wherever. So the question is, it has still to be developed what these nations are that can form a binationalism. The third question is, for me, what is a native, what is a settler? I mean, we talk about a part of the world that was for many, many centuries always controlled by empires, by different empires. Well, the Ottoman Empire, or the British Empire, and we can name a few other empires, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, I mean, you name it, you get it. And the people living there were highly diverse. This is also a subject you address in the book, that it's not just Arabs and Jews. It's a whole bunch, a diverse bunch of very different people living there. And the Jews were always one part of it, sometimes a very tiny part of it, but they were just one of the many people living there. And that is my last question. If it suffices to call it an Arab and a Jewish, whatever, nationalism or binationalism, or if we even have to find a more diverse answer to that. And it ended with the question of sovereignty, because sovereignty is, in the end, always dependent in a way on power and on force. And I mean, that will be the probably most difficult question, how to share force, how to share sovereignty. And this is not only a question for the ongoing Nakba, but it's also a question for Jews who are, in one way or the other, exposed to anti-Semitism everywhere. And it has to do with the ongoing problem that can't be resolved, which is on the heart of Christianity, and that is that the Jews are and will always be something Christianity wants to swallow and can't swallow. So there's also an ongoing problem that is not easily to be solved. So there's some legitimacy to the Jewish wish for a sovereignty that is not only granted by others. And I think this is a question that probably a few other books still have to be written about.
Thank you, Hanno. So how much do you have time to?
We have time.
Okay, very good. Okay, very good. So
lots of questions.
Yes. So let us take them in the order you presented them, and try to answer them very briefly. Maybe we can get some questions from the audience as well. So, kind of modernity, and it's really interesting that you call it liberal modernity, because you attach liberal to modernity. And that's not necessarily the case, because modernity, there is very interesting debate about whether we can speak about modernity as if it is one or modernities. And then, what is modernity? Is it really liberal principle of universal progress, or is it modernity, industrialization, and all of that stuff? So in this context, really, we have got really very much unpacking to do.
Let me just stress one word that I said, that even liberal modernity is basing on this kind of ethnic homogeneity. Even liberal modernity. There are other forms of modernity who are clearly much more.
That's exactly precisely the point, that I think liberals often are very amnesic and do very easy work for themselves by not actually intimately linking these types of things to actually colonialism, imperialism, and imperialism not to be thought only as controlling others, but also very much related to Europe. I mean, it's not that it's not only that Christian nationalism of Europe in the way Central and East Europe failed to accommodate the Jews, but also Republicans of France didn't accommodate the Jews. So in that sense, actually, we need to be much more critical about that. And, but I am not I'm not saying that modernity by definition is an evil or by definition, but we need to unpack, deconstruct these terms, and actually let's be romantic and not being not romanticizing that, because, this modernity and progress also witnessed 2 world wars, Holocaust, and many genocides of different types. And that kind of desire of homogeneity, is an extremely important constitutive, disastrous element to understand our modern history, because that kind of all the way that it started, this shift from imperial order to, that actually in certain way, we were talking about this earlier today about the Habsburg kind of empire that tolerated under very clear hierarchy, racial and religious, but tolerated diversity and actually used it and abused it in a certain way for the purposes of the empire. Actually, the nation state was very much built into the grammar of it, of dealing in a very oppressive, assimilative way with minorities and with difference and with diversity and difference that didn't really tolerate. So in that sense, actually, this takes me to your last question about Balfour Declaration, about, Balfour, you raised many points about Balfour Declarations, but let me just choose 1 or 2 for the sake of the, what is relevant here. I mean, Balfour Declaration is a very interesting colonial tool in hand of an empire that didn't own the land, gave it to European, actually, Jewry that barely existed in the land. So it's not the very clear stories about, referring to the Jews as a national group and the local native Arabs as communities, and you grant them civil and religious and some form of political rights, but not recognize them as a nation, is precisely the logic that I am talking about, that is very constitutive of modernity in the imperial manifestation of it in Palestine through the European through the British and the Zionist movement, through which actually they misrecognize the Palestinians as a national group, because the minute you recognize the Palestinians as a national group, they are entitled to sets of rights, chiefly among them self-determination in their homeland, and therefore, the consequences of that. And the issue is the troubling thing also. I agree with you that there is a very serious lure that is embedded in this liberal principle of giving giving individual rights through, kind of a neutral state, which if the story would have remained at that, but in the very concrete historical manifestation of these liberal enterprises, in the overwhelming majority of them, they were assimilative, aggressive, oppressive form of politics. In the context of Israel-Palestine, it's actually, you promise the Jews, who are insignificant minority the time Balfour Declaration was issued. The Jews barely made tiny percentage of Palestine. And then, you deprive the majority of the people. There is nothing liberal about that, because the domos of the very principle of that you give popular sovereignty to the people. The popular sovereignty of the people of Palestine would have meant that Palestine would be an Arab state with some Jews who most likely back in the time would identify themselves largely as Palestinians of some sort, and with the settler Europeans being insignificant and not impactful. The interesting story here is that actually the issue of the negation of the Palestinian, it wasn't a one state. It was if it was a one state, then it wasn't definitely liberal, because they were saying Jewish home, national Jewish home, and in that sense, recognizing self-determination only for one group. But you have a very interesting, insightful point about this one state, one state in terms of like also in relation to what the Jews are constituting in terms of their presence in Palestine. And that is basically, Palestinian nationalism went through different stages. And one of the most fascinating stages of Palestinian nationalism is basically that they spoke about, one state for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. That was the PLO program all the way until the mid-70s. So in that sense, Palestinians flirt heavily with this liberal principle of giving freedoms of religion, but actually simultaneously seeing a homogeneous form of citizenship rights. The interesting story is that actually those who are advocating two states, one state solution today, one group of those who are advocating the one state seem to be very much inspired by this legacy. But on the way, they are missing an extremely important point. And that extremely important point that the Israeli settler colonial reality in Palestine also has a very strong dimensions of national Jewish Israeli identity. And in that sense, this is something that you really cannot really ignore. You need to confront and engage the Jewish Israeli rights as well as part of an imagination if you want to go beyond partition. And in that sense, this takes me to your question about who are these two nations. And here, this is a very tricky question. This is a very tricky question in the sense that we are under no circumstances under the rubric of egalitarian binationalism speaking about the Jews as a nation. We are speaking about the Israeli Jews as a nation. And this opens wide the question of how do you exist in contemporary today times as a Jew? Because one of the most interesting things in the Jewish modern life is that Zionism managed in that sense to revolutionize the modern lives of Jews through actually reducing, the potentiality of being a Jew largely through a tribal, chauvinistic, ethnic nationalism lines that was inspired by Central and East Europe, the way the founding fathers were anyway from that part anyway, the founding fathers of Zionism. Now, what is interesting is that those who are heavily disenchanted and opposing and don't want the Zionist project and the state of Israel to speak on their behalf as Jews are increasingly critical about reducing the potentiality of being a Jew to be in ethnic, tribal, chauvinistic lines. And therefore, the spectrum now is widening again, whether that is largely in younger generations in the US and hopefully very soon in Europe through different critical voices. You are among them that says that you can be Jew also as a liberal cosmopolitan and very critical, and even in your national identity, but not through the vulgar form of nationalism. To your question about sovereignty, you are posing a very extremely critical point. This is precisely this new grammar that we are speaking. We are not saying let us dump all of these constitutive features of modern time and invent a new language. That would be something, I think, a little bit too much to ask for, because these remains to be very operative concepts that of a great value of understanding our world. However, you can interpret sovereignty differently. So sovereignty in the old paradigm of partition implies indivisible, absolute, exclusive exercise over territory. What we are introducing as a new grammar is to say sovereignty should not and ought not to be understood exclusively in the Westphalian order of total exclusivity, indivisible and absolute, but need to be understood in the post-Westphalian order through which we understand sovereignty as shared, partial, and joint. And there is no future in Israel-Palestine without operating with sovereignty as a form of a joint, shared, partial form of exercise of politics. Because the minute you operate with sovereignty under the rubric of the Westphalian order, you are shortly down the road, if not immediately, as Israel is manifesting itself, claim Jewish exclusive sovereignty. Ribunut Yehudit Eretz Israel. What does that mean, Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Israel? It means eliminating the Arabs. It means ethnic cleansing of the Arabs. It meaning Judaizing the Galilee, Judaizing the Negev, meaning de-Arabization. So in that sense, sovereignty remains to be an extremely critical concept. So is self-determination under the rubric of egalitarian binationalism. which the Arabs and the Jews, the Israeli Jews, I'm not talking about the Jews as such, but the Israeli Jews are entitled, but the way you cash out, the way you understand and cash out these very constitutive terms of modernity need to be understood in a way that we need to rethink them. And therefore, self-determination in that sense ought not to mean exclusive ethnic state, and sovereignty ought not to mean Westphalian, total, absolute, indivisible sovereignty, but shared. And the ultimate proof with that is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you cannot divide Jerusalem. It's true, because the Arabs and the Jews are intertwined in a settler colonial reality of racial hierarchy and Jewish supremacy, where you have the very significant Arab presence entwined with Jewish settlements. And since Jerusalem cannot be divided and need to be aspired for an inclusive egalitarian form of joint dwelling in Jerusalem, that needs to be applied to the whole entire land. Now, this is the principle that I am talking about. Now, which political solution specifically we can design, that is open to concrete politics. That is open to specificities of how you struggle on the ground. What is the diplomacy? What are the political specificities of that specific context that will enable the creation of I can design this with you in a condition of lab of the Jewish Museum in Hohenems. But that's not going to be helpful as a recipe for politics. Is much more dynamic and much more changing, and involves different types of powers and arrangements. So again, this is precisely what is at the core of what we are trying to do at the Kreisky Forum, to give these kind of conditions to where we can reflect critically on these terms. And in the egalitarian binationalism, as I was trying to subscribe it in my work, Israeli Jews have a lot of serious space. Yes, for self-determination for Israeli Jews. Yes, for sovereignty for the Israeli Jews. But under no circumstances, Jewish supremacy. Under no circumstances, exclusive Jewish sovereignty. Under no circumstances, Jewish state. Because Jewish state where? Jewish state in Palestine on the flesh and the body of the Palestinians. You are not talking about an empty land. And therefore, you can still answer some of the most fundamental requests of many Israeli Jews that are indeed embedded in a very traumatic European Christian history of anti-Semitism, pogrom, and persecution, which needs to be sensitive and to pay attention to, but not through at the expense of the Palestinians, but through trying to see how you can jointly have a joint dwelling and a future and joint living in that land premised on these kind of premises.
I have the uncomfortable role to play the devil's advocate. The perception of the question of dominance also depends on the focus. I mean, the way you perceive how you open the lens or close it. And one of the questions that have to be solved in a binationalist state, by nation state, however you spell that. And I think there still needs a lot of thought how to organize this in a way that fits into a situation in which you have this pretty small country. And I don't call it a state here, I just call it a country because it's a territory. I mean, we talk about a strip of land, even if we reunite it to what we had in 1948. This tiny piece of land, in the perception of the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, is surrounded by Arab states. And on the other hand, this Jewish Israeli sovereignty that now is executed on the expense of the Palestinians living in this country is guaranteed by the big brother, mainly. and by a sovereignty guaranteed by, I don't know how many atomic bombs and things like that. But it's still a sovereignty that is always getting back and forth, and this is also a subject in the book, by a self-image that is going back and forth between being a dwarf, I mean, being tiny and helpless and weak, and a superpower. I mean, it's always going back and forth between these two self-images, but this is not irrational. I mean, Israel is a superpower in a way, I mean, by its military force. And it's, on the other hand, it's a very tiny piece of land settled by Jews between a lot of Arab states with their own interests, their own problems, their own conflicts. And one part of the one strategy of Israel, how to survive, I mean, talking of their perspective, to survive in this situation is to play out the different Arab states against each other. They are big in that. But this is not irrationality, and it's also not vicious. It's simply a tactic seemingly working in this situation. And the question is how to get Israel and Palestine out of this situation being both used by the Arab powers around it and by the Western powers using it for their interests. How could, and this is a serious question, not that much for Israelis and Palestinians, but a question for Europeans. How Europeans, and also how the US and how the Arab states could leave that piece of land to those living there without always interfering with their interests, Arab interests, Muslim interests, Christian interests, US American interests, European interests. And I mean, this is, I think, the most serious question posed to us in a way. But how shared sovereignty, I mean, to name it, a shared military of Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs or Arab Palestinians or however you name it, how this can be organized. I think this will be the core of in the end, the core of the question, how this can work.
So very
I mean, regularly you organize an army against somebody. Who is the one you organize this joint army against? This is a question.
Okay. So Hannah, before I move into the practicalities of potential institutional arrangements with arms, such as army and constitutions maybe and other stuff, but you have raised very interesting question in relation to the context within which Israel and Palestine exist. And it's really very interesting that actually Israel doesn't miss an opportunity through its different leaders from the day it was established until today to be exiling itself and externalizing itself from the Middle East and the Arabs by saying we are actually the villa in the jungle. We are Europe in the Middle East. And we are part of the European, the construction of this fictitious problematic terms that's called Judeo-Christian civilization, which is, whereas the Jews were taken only like a decade or three, depends which historical reference we are talking about, to concentration camps by millions. So, we have these very troubling concepts, and actually Israel, tries heavily not to be affiliated with the Middle East. It's actually always affiliated with Europe and so on. And that also bigger questions about actually European philo-Semitism and European colonial dimensions. And this is why Zionism should not only understood as an answer to the European question, to the Jewish question through this kind of how to get rid of the Jews, but it also these kind of strategic aims of having Israel in the geographical place that it has, and the play it plays as we speak in terms of these types of things. So this is one observation. The second observation, yes, I mean, Palestine is an Arab territory, and it's part and parcel of the Arab integrated historical region. Actually, Zionism is an interruption of centuries of dominant, kind of Muslim, Christian, Arab type of reality of some sort in different magnitudes and different grammar. So the question is not, you are right about the use and abuse of the case and to mobilize it and capitalize on it for geostrategic interests that are not consistent with the demands of the locals who constitute that. That's an observation that you are right about, that you need, although you cannot draw kind of symmetry between the Arabs and the Jews in this in this respect, because the Arabs see themselves as the natives. But it is, you have to ask yourself, and there is a question that is deeper than that, I think. And that is that you look today, let us go back to Zionism, because Zionism is the starting point of analysis in that sense, in at least one of the starting points of analysis. I mean, Zionism really revolutionized Jewish life post-Holocaust time. The bond here was way much stronger than Zionism, okay? Zionism was a minority group among the Jews of Europe, even when it started its Aliyah and the basically settler colonial movements to Palestine. But Zionism managed to revolutionize this kind of, and created the state of Israel. So the Jew, in that sense, Zionism achieved a very remarkable, seducing thing that speaks to the psyche and to the specificities of modern Jewish life. And that is to have a protected, safe home, supposedly. Protected, safe home. So in that sense, Zionism managed to create a state that is, and in that sense, like, you know, you want to be a nation like other nations. But there is one thing, there are two things that are intimately linked to that. So while Zionism managed to revolutionize Jewish life and creating that kind of Jewish home, Zionism failed miserably in delivering on two things. That is normalization and recognition, meaning legitimacy. Now, in the eyes of the Palestinians, and this is very timely because the Trump kind of normalizing agreements with the Emirates and Bahrain, you know, these are regimes that are, you know, normalizing. And with segments of elites that have certain interest in these regimes, because these regimes are not just the, you know, there are ruling elites, some of them, not all of them, having these interests. But Zionism, and in that sense, the state of Israel, in the eyes of its victims, meaning the Palestinians, they have no full legitimacy and sure no normalization. And the ultimate proof of that every single time a Palestinian or an Israeli Jew encounters a Palestinian, there is something disruptive in that meeting in the side of the Israeli Jews. And that is because, and why is that extremely important? That is extremely important because Israel, after almost 70 years of its existence, is coming now to the Palestinians when they are in the most weakest points of his history in the last few decades, fragmented, you know, disoriented, and as the PLO to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And that is a very interesting dialectics of master and slave, that Israel seeks and continues to be inferior in the understanding that it wouldn't achieve full legitimacy until the Palestinians are granting that legitimacy. And the Palestinians are not going to grant that legitimacy if they don't get their full rights. And in that sense, Israel needs to make also, I mean, the Jewish Israeli brothers need to understand that actually it needs to cater for Middle Eastern themselves in a way. And adding to that, the equation of the Mizrahi Jews without romanticizing the Mizrahi Jews in terms of like many of them having their political views are very far away from that, supporting actually vulgar ethnic, you know, form of nationalism for historical, sociological reasons that are not the matter of the conversations here. But they do symbolize it. Sorry, they do symbolize something of a different regional arrangement through which that existence and presence of Israeli Jewish presence can be integrated, but in a different language than colonialism, supremacy, and colonial control, through actually envisioning some form of Levantinian identity, some Mediterranean form of identity, you know, but not the way Paris advocates it of the new Middle East, not the way Trump is advocating through the Middle East. And that is precisely because the only way forward, actually, I would be as ambitious and maybe cynical but for the purpose of illuminating an idea, actually, I think the Palestinians in this sinking ship are the potential savior of the Israeli Jews from actually the evil of their domination, control, and lack of justice, through the fact that actually the Palestinians are going to, not all the Palestinians, but, and not all of the Israeli Jews, because I think those who are, in my point of view, are flirting with these new ideas of envisioning a jointed dwelling that is premised on, principles. What's wrong with equality, my friends? Since when equality is problem? Why justice is problem? So why, when we come to the Israeli Jews, justice becomes a problem and equality becomes a problem? That's no go. And this is why I think we potentially might find partners, maybe like you, with Jews, Israelis, and Palestinians, through which they can definitely be partners for the conversation.
I now just want to open the floor and allow questions here in the space, but also in the chat, and invite you to engage in the discussion, even if you don't have too many minutes left. But you presented so many open questions, and I had to react on some of them. I have one word from the chat that is simply thanks a lot for presenting these uncomfortable strains of analysis courageously. That's a comment that's coming out of the chat. But let's first start with possible interventions here. And yeah, please.
Thank you for this very inspirational talk. I have one question coming out of my contacts with opposition groups in Lebanon, because for a long time the so-called concessional model in Lebanon served as some kind of a blueprint how diverse societies could be governed in a way. But now this model is more or less bankrupt. And these people I talked to, they try to set up a more secular alternative, or what they would call a civil state. In your talk, you were mostly speaking about the normative foundation of the binational state. But when it comes to institutions, I think you would have to, at some point at least, try to design state institutions, whatever they may be, in order to kind of regulate this binational society in a way that equality and solidarity become institutionalized in the state. Would you lay this out a little bit, please?
Thank you very much. This is a brilliant question, I have to say. So, I mean, concessional democracy or concessionalism is about power sharing arrangement, okay? Power sharing arrangement comes to address issues of diversity and enclaves of, delineated enclaves of political disagreements, or it could be ethnic, it could be ideological. Austria is one example, because you have different kind of, it's almost a federation. No, it's defined as a federation. You have different provinces, or I don't know how you call them here, but provinces. States. So it doesn't have to be always ethnic. It doesn't have to be ethnic. It could be ideological as well, as in the case of Austria, for instance. So you are absolutely right about concessional arrangements as one potential venture of institutional arrangements that need to be constitutive of any future arrangement for Israel-Palestine. So I think you are absolutely right in that sense. Or at least you are absolutely right in expanding the range of constitutional arrangements and designs along these types of lines, because concessional democracy is less of a normative blueprint. It's more of an institutional form of arrangement, which is, a very serious departure from liberal democracy if it means benign neglect and politics of sameness, meaning neutrality, meaning only individuals and no other type of divisions, but one person, one vote, along the lines of the freedom of association and the freedom of expression will give you all the space to articulate your diversity, and the state is going to be neutral in that relationship. So you are right that constitutional democracy is already a very serious departure from the classical liberal notion, which speaks about benign neglect and difference blind type of neutral state. Now, how does that relate to the binational arrangements that are to the binational egalitarian binationalism as an ethical principle? And that is that I refrained as much as I can through the entire conversation not to fall into designating and subscribing to very particular institutional constitutional design. And that is not because I don't have preferences myself. I think it would be it would be problematic in my eye to come and say, this is the blueprint, meaning that there is only one blueprint. And that is for various reasons. Some of these reasons has to be with the fact that actually you need carrier of these things on the ground, agents that will realize this. And definitely politics is way much more complicated and dynamic than being actually understood, just as something that you come with a blueprint. In my point of view, egalitarian binationalism, the way I subscribe it to it, and others as well, actually opens the spectrum as a normative principle. You were referring to the norm as a normative principle, as an ethical guiding principle, opens the potentialities for multiple range or for a wide range of possibilities of constitutional and institutional arrangement. Some of that could be federation, confederations, even two states, but not the two states that they speak about. And under no doubt, this will include and definitely engage some form of constitutional arrangements that will have to manifest itself on the ground for sure.
I mean, I would like to insist a bit in this Lebanon case study, and that is, I think what Lebanon showed is that a binationalism, or in this case, even tri-ethnicalism, producing a state on three constituting entities. In the moment when you don't create a public sphere and a democratic sphere that includes all groups into one process, you run into a problem. And that is that in the end, it's an elitist arrangement of those who organize themselves as the leaders of an ethnicity. And that is the ruin of every principle of democracy, because democracy is about decisions and not about birth. And so Lebanon, I think, is the best example for how not to organize a binational state.
Sure, and again, Lebanon is a very tricky example, since Lebanon is one nation. It's not like you have there, the organizations of these cleavages are along confessional rather than national lines, okay? And actually, Lebanon is a very interesting story in relation to your argument that, there are these calls that they are asking for civil, actually, democracy. And that is also not only Lebanon, actually, before that in Egypt and many other places. And actually, in our book, we say about this assimilative pan-Arabism and, Baathism as very aggressive ideologies that actually oppress these types of diversities. So there are very interesting debate in that. Israel-Palestine is very different for a very obvious reason, is thanks to Zionism mostly. And thanks to Zionism, given the fact that actually Zionism brought this kind of vulgar ethno-nationalism of Europe that actually suffered from them as a Jews and basically brought it and imported it into the context of Palestine. But even if you want to and even when you want to depart from that, which I argue that there is no way but to depart from that and to start to dismantle this kind of premises of ethno-nationalism in the vulgar way the Zionism manifests itself in there, is actually you start departing to a little bit a milder form of communitarianism without actually giving up on that national identification, simply because in the case of the Israeli Jews, because of anti-Semitism, because of the Holocaust, because of many other reasons, it seems to be that this identifications of nationalism as an entry remains to be very powerful. For the case of the Palestinians, is a completely different story, relates to what Hanu was mentioning, and that is the colonial imperial legacy with the British and with the Zionist movement of negating the Palestinians, including at the hands of some Arab regimes that actually did not want to recognize Palestinians as a national group. The most important achievement of Palestinian nationalism is that today Palestine and the Palestinians are not contested as a national group, as a national case. This wasn't the case 30 years ago. Okay? So in that sense, conciliational arrangements are not inspirational only in the case of, the overwhelming majority of the democracies of the world are conciliational in certain capacities or forms. The Lebanese example is very problematic for its own specificities. One of them really invoked counter arguments that could be invoked by many Israeli scholars and intellectuals that I converse with is that actually this is a Balkanization, that binationalism is Balkanizing Israel, as if Israel-Palestine is in heaven and we in the Arabs and the Jews are in very loving relationship, and this kind of partition concept is working and operation, which is absolutely nonsense. That's a misreading of reality. The misreading of reality is, and this is by this I finish because it's extremely important, because the alternative of distancing yourself from the language of nationalism, whether that in its vulgar, but even in the milder, thinner way of communitarianism, is to collapse into liberalism. And the question is that I want to challenge the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews and the Israeli Jewish and the Jewish intellectuals, not only the Israeli, whether they are willing to subscribe to one person, one vote in that land. The one person, one vote will face way much more greater opposition by the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews and Jewish intellectuals. No, not Jewish intellectuals, Jewish world Jewry, let us call it, okay? Jewish intellectuals are something that are, category that is very problematic. I don't think there are many Jewish intellectuals anywhere in contemporary times. I mean, in the sense of critical engagement. That is very troubling, because that is meaning that actually what Hanu was hinting to, that you don't actually recognize Israeli Jews as national groups. So the questions of conciliationism leads us also, if you don't want conciliationism, so what do you want? You want liberal state? Let us subscribe to liberal state. But then they will tell you, centuries of anti-Semitism, persecution of Jews, our identity is very central to us, then you will have to give the national entry an importance. And I do give a national entry importance, but not as through Jewish supremacy and exclusivity and privilege, but through egalitarian lines.
There is a question from the chat, and that is from Felicitas Herman Jelinek. Bashir, you several times mentioned the Jewish question, a very specific political term, first used at the end of the 19th century, then at the turn of the century, later in the framework of the final solution. And then you mentioned the Muslim question. Would you elaborate on that terminus and its background you refer to? What you meant with the Muslim question?
Well, very briefly, I mean, again, these questions have their own genealogies, and it's became fashionable today to term many things as questions. The woman question, the Muslim questions. But very briefly, without being too superficial about this, but engage seriously with these types of questions. The issue of the Muslim question is very intimately related also to very serious structures of Orientalism in European imagination. But the contemporary manifestation of that is actually with the greater increased numbers of immigrants coming from different Muslim backgrounds into European kind of context, raises again and puts the European nationalism in the mirror in front of a racialized other that is called Muslim. And in that sense, the Muslim question is basically relating to the capacity and the lack of capacity of European nationalism and European political arrangements to accommodate on the premise of inclusiveness and equality, Muslim presence that is in itself very diverse, because you cannot homogenize even the Muslim presence itself. But the most important thing is the logic of otherizing here. Again, Europe is facing this very problematic issue of otherization, where the Muslim question is very different from the Jewish question, but the historical conceptual frameworks that are informing the Muslim question and Islamophobia the way it is emerging today has very much to do with the very much of roots of the failure of European nationalism, Christian European nationalism, to handle the Jewish question. And that's it.
We have one question here in the space, and I think that will be the last question because we have to come to an end for today.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I also agree to your statement that egalitarian nationalism is the prerequisite for peace in the Middle East. But I don't like the term nationalism, because the term nationalism has been overcome in Europe, in many European countries. And maybe we are too late to speak about nationalism, but we should speak about the human interests and human rights. And I think many young Palestinians won't think about a Palestinian state, but they think of a kind of peace, a kind of perspective. And the same is maybe true for Israelis, Israeli Jews or Israeli Arabs. They don't think about the big nation, but they think about, let's say, international life, prosperity, social peace, etc. But my question is, what can be done that this difference between the powers, so this imbalance of powers, you know, the Israeli state is very strong, and there are very strong groups, the religious settlers, the non-religious settlers. There are a lot of interests, and the Bible has promised the land to many of them. What can you do to achieve a kind of balance of power on the side of the Palestinians? I mean, the Palestinians have a difficult economical situation. Education is in a bad situation. The social situation is difficult. There is no democracy. So how can the level of the Palestinians be put up just to have a kind of equal chances, let's say?
Okay. I will answer that very briefly, if I may. I mean, I don't have time, and it's beyond, you know, to relate to your first part. I'm not entirely sure that nationalism is over in Europe. I'm not entirely sure that Europe is post-national. I don't think this country is a very clear manifestation to why nationalism remains to be very powerful. But I don't want to argue with that. But I have some serious, you know, argument about many of what you said in the first part. But the second part, I think, is a very, very challenging question, because you are right. You know, what are the incentives for Israeli Jews to move to this egalitarian binationalism or to give up their privileges? And I think here, there is a very serious challenge, and I think I don't have a satisfactory full answer to that. But part of what I think is that actually the Palestinians have shown remarkable resilience, and I think this is the way continue to be forward. Now, with very serious troubles on the way, that is that I think it has become very demanding today for the Palestinian struggle for many reasons. One of it is philo-Semitism, European complicity, American dishonesty of brokership, many other things, but also Palestinian internal fragmentation, corruptions, and many other issues, lack of unity and many. But however, the Palestinians are being cornered more than any time before in the past few decades. And that is actually when the Palestinians choose nonviolence activities and tools and measures and policies and practices to move forward after the world has been pushing them, as well as that they have come to the realization, certain quarters of them, that this is the way forward, and they appeal to the Hague and the ICC. This is called diplomatic terror. When the Palestinians start saying that the way to pressure Israel and to exercise leverage on Israel for those countries who can leverage with Israel, i.e. EU, European countries, and the US, and that is that the Israeli Jews need to be cornered through different kinds of techniques of possible political pressure through labeling settlements, products, and different sanctions and all of that stuff. That is called basically, again, diplomatic terror. And when the Palestinians are coming to exhibit and express things in Germany, and Hanu knows that very well, and some of you probably have heard. And when you come to articulate the very basic premise that you as a human being, as an oppressed person, have the right to speak your mind and to advocate justice, freedom, and equality, that is being invoked as what? Scientific terror, as cultural terror, and therefore, as a Palestinian artist, as a Palestinian spokesperson, as a Palestinian intellectual, as a Palestinian diplomat, as a Palestinian civil society organization, you are labeled as a terror. Human rights NGOs in Ramallah and different parts of the country that advocate human rights. So what is left for the Palestinians? That is an invitation for where the Palestinians today also need to know and to reflect how they can learn lessons, but also how they can exert pressure and make the occupation painful and costly. Without the Palestinians making the occupation painful and costly to the Israelis, I don't think anything will be achieved, because the complicity and the dishonesty of the hypocrisy of Europe and many other Western countries are known. But that is not to suggest that Europe doesn't have responsibility. Europe has a responsibility, not only to the Israeli Jews, but also to the Palestinian Arabs, because the Palestinian question, as we do in the Kreisky work, would have not been created without the Europeans not coming to terms with the rights of the Jews in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bashir. I think that was a good point to end this evening. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I'm pretty sure we won't have you here for the last time. And we have to discuss the question of the Muslim question, but that is a subject for another topic, and that is more centered about the European idea of liberalism today and the idea of European secularism, and if Europe is able to go beyond an idea of a Christian secularism into something that is really inclusive. But that's a question for another event, another conversation with you and others, a conversation you're all invited to join. Thank you very much for being with us, and see you next time. We'll see how the COVID pandemic will allow events here in the museum, but definitely it won't prevent us from doing events on Zoom. So thank you also for joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. Have a nice evening, and see you again. Bye-bye.